Hello all, welcome to the new Simply Put series by Kalam Academy. This is Priyanka Mahapatra, faculty at Kalam. So today we'll be having a discussion on the newspaper dated 29th November 2023. So in the text and the context section of the Hindu newspaper, the first article is about the need to disclose political donations is very important from our UPSC perspective. So we will be discussing this. Again, there was an important article based on RBI's latest move to increase the risk weights for lending. This is also important. We will be discussing that. Again, there were some articles in the Indian Express newspaper about the unseasonal rains and the lightning strikes in Gujarat. That also we'll be discussing. And also about the COP28 and the India's role specifically we would be talking about. Right? So let's get started. So the first article is about the COP28, which is beginning soon in Dubai. So India's role at the climate conferences over the years and its key promises, the red lines, the challenges, those things we are going to discuss in the coming slides. So this becomes very important from your GS paper 3 perspective and also from your essay perspective where the environmental conservation becomes a topic, right? So India is an influential voice for the developing countries at the annual COP events. India is a very key player to represent on behalf of the developing countries at the climate summits every year. Why is that? Because it is one of the largest economy. It is the third largest emitter of the greenhouse gases. And an interesting fact, you might have not known that India had hosted one of these conferences way back in 2008, that is the COP8 summit. Coming to the emissions, India's emissions are being closely targeted by all the countries. Why? Because it is one of the biggest emitters of the greenhouse gases that we learned that it is the third largest emitter. And the emissions they have grown almost fourfold between 1970 and now. 40% of the emissions coming from the electricity production sector. But however, India's emissions are low in the per capita terms, even less than half of the global average, which indicates that we have lower access to energy, we have lower consumption levels, and relatively lower standards of living. This fact is cited by India every time to counter any international demand that says to cap its overall emissions, arguing that it needs to lift its people to similar standards of living as in the developed countries. So, what is the status of India at the COPs historically? What has been the situation? What has been the stand of India at COPs historically? Since 1992 Earth Summit, India has ensured that the burden of climate action does not disproportionately fall on the developing countries. That is why it has played a lead role in the Kyoto Protocol Summit at COP3 in 1997 in bringing out a principle that is CBDRRC, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, where India is of the stand that while fighting the climate change is everyone's job, the rich and the developed countries must bear the bulk of that responsibility, not because they have caused most of the emissions, but they have enough resources and they are capable of doing that. That is why in the summit it was finalized that the rich and the developed countries they must have the specific emission cut target, and that is to be implemented in the span of 2008 to 2012 period. And while developing countries they are free to take whatever nationally appropriate climate actions they can take. So you know now that the restrictions were placed on the rich countries because they were responsible for most of the emissions and they were having large resources with them to help out the developing countries. Due to these restrictions, there was gradual erosion of the principle in every COP decision. So in this case, India's main effort at every COP was to prevent this erosion. Therefore, in Paris Agreement, what we did that we let go these restrictions, we allowed every country, including the developed ones, to decide and implement their own climate action. We did not impose anything on them that you have to do this, you have to do that, but we allowed every country to decide their own climate action. So here everybody is supposed to have a climate action plan with them that is called as nationally determined contribution or NDC, but there were no mandatory targets for any country. So India during the years has seen a shift in its role. In the recent years, it has become more assertive, more demanding, contrary to the past where the role was largely in the background. For example, in 2021 Glasgow meeting, India blocked the final draft outcome at the last minute. It got the phase out of the coal changed to phase down of the coal in the last minute because it was in the India's interest not to phase out the coal completely so early because of its developmental needs. Similarly, in the Sharm el-Sheikh meeting, India has campaigned for a phase down of all the fossil fuels, not just coal. And also it is talking about the need for lifestyle changes now, for bringing down the energy consumption and the emissions level. It has come up with the emission life mission, that is lifestyle for environment mission. Right? So again in the climate commitments also, Delhi has submitted its 2 NDCs till now. In the first NDC, there were some 3 targeted promises which we need to know from the mains perspective and also from the prelims perspective. India pledged to reduce its emission intensity by 33 to 35% from 2005 levels by 2030, and also it seeks to at least 40% of its installed energy capacity in 2030 should be comprising of non-fossil fuel sources. And also it is interested to create at least 2.5 to 3 billion tons of additional carbon sink through the tree and the forest cover. So these were the targeted promises which India made in the first NDC. And to the surprise, India has already achieved their targets 8 years in advance. So it has raised the targets of the first 2 promises also. For example, it has raised from 35% to 40% now with respect to the emissions intensity of GDP between 2005 and 2030. Also, it has raised the non-fossil fuel based electricity target to 50% now from the previous target of 40%. So these you need to remember from the prelims and the mains perspective. So what are the initiatives Indian government has taken in this regard? So there are many global initiatives India has taken at the front. For example, in 2015 Paris meeting, it led to the foundation of International Solar Alliance, which is talking about the installation of solar energy across the world. And now it has evolved into full-fledged UN-affiliated multilateral agency. Also, it has led to the foundation of Coalition of Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, CDRI, which is a global knowledge center for creation of more resilient infrastructure. Similarly, it has got the International Energy Agency, that is IEA, to do an analysis of its proposals, due to which IEA said that nearly 60% of the savings could be directly mandated by the governments, respective governments. After which India came up with its lifestyle mission launched in the G20 Summit 2023. So these are the initiatives India has taken in this regard. So India has been a part of many formal and informal groups with respect to the climate change policies. For example, it is a part of the BASIC group, which is a very prominent group in terms of climate change talks. So it comprises of Brazil, South Africa, India and China. Similarly, the like-minded developing countries bloc is also a very prominent bloc comprising of 20 large developing countries, of which India is a part. So coming to the India's rejection points, where India is not on the same page with the developed countries. India here is not ready to reduce emissions because India's climate actions, they are framed in terms of emissions intensity. That is emissions per unit of GDP and not on emissions directly. This means that while India's emissions would continue to grow in the short and the medium term, emissions as a proportion to the GDP would decline. Right? Then India also rejects to define a peak for its emission or a peak year for its emission. India is of the viewpoint that the immediate shutdown of coal-fired power plants cannot happen in India's case. They are going to rely on coal for power production for at least a decade and a half. Again, it has always rejected the emission cuts in the agricultural sector, which is comprising of 15% of the total annual emissions in case of India. Because it would mean that we have to change the cropping pattern, and if we change the cropping pattern, it has huge implication for the India's food security. So these are the major rejection areas where India is standing firm on its points. Right? So this was all about this topic's discussion. Let's move on to the next. So the second article we are going to discuss is about the need to disclose political donations. So it is important from your GS paper 2 and your essay paper where topics like transparency and democracy appear in the essay paper, and you can use these data. So why do we need to disclose the political donations in a democracy? Because the key element of democracy is electoral justice, which talks about the upholding of rule of law and holding free and fair elections, upholding the principle of transparency. Because transparency is the key to preserve the citizens' trust in the parties and politicians. Transparency will remove the corruption in the process. Thereby, it will maintain the rule of law. But electoral bonds, because of its anonymous principle, it is violative of the transparency principle. Thereby, it will undermine the free and the fair elections. Therefore, for a healthy democracy, we need to fully publicize all the donations that is made to the political party. So there are some international models which have always favored to disclose the political donations. For example, in 1910, it is the United States that has enacted the Publicity Act, which made the funding of the political parties and candidates both to be disclosed in the public. Also, it has imposed limits on the political contributions as well. Similarly, in 2014, European Union has enacted the regulation of the European Parliament and of the Council, where it has set a limit on the value of donation one can receive per year. Right? So from these two examples, we have come to know that there are two distinct requirements. One is complete disclosure of the donors above certain minimal amounts, and there has to be a cap on the donations as well. There has to be some limit on the political. So what is the road ahead which the article is talking about? It is saying to have a separate legislation that will mandate the public disclosure of the identity of the donors above a certain nominal limit to the political parties and the candidates. Please note here that we need to have the details of the donations to the political parties altogether and to individual candidates also. Then it is also talking about the immediate reporting of large donations to the Election Commission. It is mandating that the political party accounts be made public and reported to the Election Commission. It is saying about the auditing of the accounts by the third party. It is saying about setting limits on the funding and the expenditure by the political parties. And it is saying about mechanism of enforcement of the law. Unless there is enforcement mechanism, nobody will obey and implement the laws, which is against their vested interest. So these are the recommendations one can write in the mains exam if any question is coming about the political donations and about the electoral bonds. Then we come to the third article of the day, that is RBI's latest move to increase the risk weight for lending. So recently, RBI has issued regulatory measures to all the banks and the NBFCs both to increase their risk weights associated with the consumer credit and bank credit by an additional 25 percentage points. So RBI is now directing the banks and the NBFCs to reserve more capital for the risk associated with the loans it is giving out. So it has been increased by 25 percentage points. So this directive is applicable to the personal loan excluding housing loans. It is applicable to the educational loans, vehicle loans, loans secured by the gold and gold jewelry. Again, it is not applicable to the SHG loans and microfinance. This you need to remember from your prelims perspective. Let's now understand what is credit risk in order to understand this article. So credit risk is the risk which is given by the borrower when he or she is not able to fulfill her commitments on repaying the loans, when he or she is defaulting on the repayment of the loan. And here the RBI is saying the bank to increase the risk weight. Some amount of money is kept as risk weight with the bank to tackle the situation where the borrower is not paying his or her loan. So it is an essential tool for the bank to manage this risk whenever a borrower is unable to pay his loan. So it is an essential holding that the lender, here the bank, ideally should be having to adjust the associated risk if the borrower is defaulting on the payment. Right? So why there is a need now? Because of the increased unsecured personal loans. So it has increased by 23% year on year basis. Outstanding loans from the credit cards, they have also increased by 30%. And the delinquencies, that is a loan overdue by more than 90 days, stood at 0.84% for all these personal loans. So this is why the directive has come now in order to safeguard the banks, right? So what is the impact of the directive now on the borrowers and the lenders both? This becomes very important from your prelims perspective. So you have to understand now that if the risk weight has been increased, that means the lender has to keep more money now for the risk associated with the loan. Then there has been less money now to lend to the borrowers, right? So there will be higher capital requirement, more money is required for the bank now to lend to the borrower because some amount of money, some increased amount of money is now being blocked. Thereby, it will increase the lending rates for the consumers now. The interest rates will be more now for the borrowers. There will be slow loan growth for the lenders. Nobody will be interested to take loan now. So there will be slower loan growth. And there will be hit on profits therefore for the banks. So these are the impacts of the directive. Then we come to the fourth article of the day, that is the unseasonal rains and the lightning strikes in Gujarat that has happened. So this becomes important from your GS1 perspective. We'll be looking at the reasons for such happening. There are three reasons cited for this. First is western disturbance over the Pakistan region. Second is the cyclonic circulation that has happened over the northeastern Arabian Sea and the adjoining Saurashtra and the Kutch region, that is the state of Gujarat and Rajasthan. Then the third reason stated is easterly trough, that is upper air trough in the easterlies from southwest Arabian Sea to the northeast Arabian Sea. So coming to understand the western disturbances and the easterly winds. So western disturbances, these are the storms that originate over the Mediterranean Sea and they bring rainfall to the northwestern India in the winter. So this is a unique property of the western disturbances which have come in the exam many times. So this becomes important from your prelims perspective. Similarly, the easterly winds, they flow from the east throughout the year and basically in the equatorial region. So the lightning happened because the first spell of rain happened after a very long dry period, resulting in the convective activity which resulted in the lightning. Again, why thunderstorm happened? Because of the presence of more moisture interacting with the western disturbance. So here, when there is a low pressure area, it attracts the air from all its surrounding to fill up that space. And with the sufficient presence of moisture, the rain activity can be enhanced significantly, resulting in the thunderstorm activity happening from the western disturbances. Another reason is that the ITCZ, that is Intertropical convergence zone, which is located slightly north of the equator, is active in this season. So thereby it has provided sufficient moisture to the area and fed into the western disturbance system, resulting in the thunderstorm activity. So these were the major reasons for which there were unusual rains and lightning strikes happened in Gujarat. So this was all about the today's discussion. Thank you so much.